Cool. My name is Tom Hutley, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the London Borough of Camden. So I'm going to call it Consider Camden. When we think of a lot of our tourism and the history across London, it's really easy to focus on areas such as Westminster, the City of London, Southwark, all these places with the quite prominent sites that people want to go. But often we forget about the really large, expansive London Borough of Camden. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to split it up into two parts. The first is really just to kind of come up with lots of ideas, institutions, places that call Camden their home to really demonstrate the true power and how many institutions just lie underneath our noses every day as we regularly drive through the borough. That's going to be the first part. And the second part, I want to do kind of like a little bit of a mock walk using the Google Maps that I've got here through the borough just to see. Actually, I'm going to go through Fitzrovia over to Bloomsbury, both within the London Borough of Camden. I'm going to cross across those so we can see what we can find on our tour today. Bit of a history to predate the London Borough of Camden. Camden, obviously, of course, come out in 1965. This was from the London Government Act of 1963 to tidy up a lot of the metropolitan boroughs. Of course, there's a lot of cross confusion between who managed what across the different areas. So London Borough of Camden was born out of Hampstead, Holborn and the London Borough of St Pancras. They all formed together, and the reason why it was called Camden is that Camden Town was just appropriately really sort of in the central part of it. Any boroughs during the 1965 Reformation there, they actually had to agree on just one single name. There's a few exceptions to this, but they've got their own sort of backstory to that. I'm going to scan over to where are we? This map here, and this kind of highlights really just how vast the borough is. So talking right up to Fortune Green, West Hampstead, Kilburn, Highgate right up in the north there. Of course, Highgate is split across 3 different boroughs, but Camden obviously has quite a large chunk of it, and even right down south. We're talking Holborn, Covent Garden right on the edge there, and Bloomsbury as well. So let's get thinking. I don't know what's happened there. Get rid of that. There we go. Want to get thinking about some of the fine institutions that are in Camden. So the borough of Camden takes its name from, of course, Camden Town. And Camden Town was named after Charles Pratt, who was the very first Earl of Camden, 1795. And the motto of Camden Council is actually not for self, but for all. Some famous institutions, I'm going to rattle these out in any order really, but just some of the most notable ones. The British Library is the largest library in the world. So that's a really, really interesting fact to tell anyone you have on board. But that's largely the largest because of the amount of items that are held within their collection. The British Museum, of course, the most visited, popular tourist attraction within London, with people, I think, some about 2 million visitors every year that pass through the doors. The British Medical Association, Charles Dickens, we know by the blue plaque that's there on Tavistock Square, had a house once on that site. Great Ormond Street Hospital, providing obviously excelling world-class healthcare to children for some over 200 years or more. Royal College of Anaesthetists, Red Lion Square, Royal College of GPs, which used to be right by Euston Station. I'm not too sure where it might be now. Royal College of Physicians, that wonderful brutalist style building just on the edge of Regent's Park, just before you come up to the John Nash buildings on the right hand side. Royal College of Surgeons, Veterinary Surgeons. You have 3 major railway terminuses in the London Borough of Camden, of course, Euston, St Pancras and King's Cross. Senate House, wow, what a wonderful building. You forget about that huge skyscraper, that modernist masterpiece within the London Borough of Camden. I'll be showing that later on our street view map. University College London, again a huge medical facility here right in the heart of the borough. It's where the first general anaesthetic procedures first took place in Europe. Some other key attractions within the borough: BT Tower, Bloomsbury Square. Bloomsbury Square, in fact, was actually said to be one of the very first squares laid out in London. Originally called Southampton Square, we know it today with the the cordon bleu on the west side, and you've got the Liverpool Victoria Insurance Building, or that's the people that occupied the Victoria House on the east side. Fabulous square. Camden Market, quite obvious, but only recently sort of in vogue. In 1960s with Dingwalls, which was an old timber yard. Before that was purchased out and transformed into the marketplace and venues that we know of today. The Dickens House on Doughty Street. We also forget the fact that whilst that's the one that we go and visit in terms of a museum, right in Bloomsbury, if you go over into Fitzrovia, just on the east side of Cleveland Street, there's a house that's just been discovered within the past 5 years or so that was Dickens's very first home in London, his former childhood home. And on that very same street, you have the workhouse that it is believed that he based the workhouse and Oliver Twist on. It's being redeveloped into modern apartments, but I think it still bears that same name. The Foundling Museum, effectively one of the very first orphanages in London, set up in the 18th century to follow suit to some of the foundling hospitals and care places that we had in Europe. There's so much to be said about that. The Freud Museum, Hampstead Heath, of course, Hatton Garden, of course, still within the borough. Highgate Cemetery, the Roundhouse, old railway turntable shed, and of course, once locomotives got a little bit too large, because it's a round building, you can't reappropriate a round building, you can't expand it, so they had to then reappropriate usage of it. It became actually a whiskey storage, whiskey, not necessarily distillery, but a place to store whiskey. The name beats me as to who the gentleman was who ran that. And of course, London Zoo as well. Also has the third oldest university in the country, which is the University of London. They achieved their Royal Charter in 1836. Not a third place prize, not to be scoffed at, because of course first and second would be Oxford and Cambridge. So I'm going to dive in now onto the street view I want to do. So if I make me a little bit smaller so we can see a bit more of that map, I'm going to start at Good Street. So hopefully, if I've done my knowledge right, I should be able to find Good Street Station. Here we go. Cool. And I hope that's going to drop us in the middle of the road, which it hasn't. So you might have to bear with me a little bit on this, because it does click you about depending where you are on Street View. Oh, cool. We'll see. We can see if we can deal with it. You can just see a wonderful tile in there of Good Street Station. Many of you know the architect behind these stations. This is a Leslie Green station, famed for obviously that wonderful red brick, those lovely archways there, and eminent of the flat roof. All of his stations were built with that flat roof to encourage the idea of offices being put on top, residential, whatever it may be. Some are just left completely flat. If you look at Tufnell Park Station, that's got offices on top of it, but I think at one point, of course, it would have been flat. Even if you look at, say, like the Wolseley Hotel on Knightsbridge, you'll notice that was actually an old Leslie Green tube station before they actually got rid of the tubes there altogether. So let's try to get back out into the street. The other great thing with any stations that are on the Northern Line, I'm not going to be able to get into the middle of the road, am I? Come back. Let's go there on the corner of Cheney Street. There we go. So we can just see the edge of it there. The other great thing about stations on the Northern Line is that, of course, Northern Line is the deepest level tube. So lots of the stations actually have underground bunkers. One of the most prominent ones on the Northern Line is actually under Good Street Station. So this was actually used during World War II. And some of you may know on Cheney Street, this wonderful building here, the Eisenhower Centre. Now this is actually one of the entrances to that underground bunker, and was named after Dwight Eisenhower, who was the military general of America stationed in London at that time of World War II, before later becoming US President. So I'm going to crunch through Cheney Street now. We're going to go over to Gower Street, and we're going to look at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, only rather fitting with what's going on in the world right now with COVID-19. So there we go. There's the emblem there on the gates. That's the H, the T, and the M. Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, London School of. And as you drive down Gower Street, you will notice some names. There'll be more names on this side now. There's actually just recently more names were added. There's a few up there, and these are all people that have worked within health, within medicine, who had advanced and pioneered that world of medicine. One other thing to point out when you're in the cab as well is some of these little creatures that are up on the balconies here. So these are like little lice, ticks, things like that. And these are basically the sort of animals, insects and things that can spread disease. And this is actually how the formation of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine came about. So in 1899, Sir Patrick Manson actually set up the hospital in the docks, because of course a lot of the men who are away at sea would contract some of these lices and things, and bring them back to London. So it was kind of a first port of call for them to try and be screened and not spread the disease further into London. And this is how it officially got its first got set up. It moves to this site around the 1920s. So there's some other names, of course, along the top there. And until recently, even just as late as last year, there was no women's names on this frieze. There was always contention, always said to be like, why don't we have more women, female pioneers on here? Florence Nightingale, who I forgot, Marie Curie, Alice Ball, who Alice Ball came up with the Ball method of curing leprosy. And there was always a bit of backlash, and one of them was that, Nightingale is far too long a name. We couldn't possibly fit it on this frieze. To which someone then pointed out, well, there's the German doctor of Pentenhofer, which I think is about the same length, if not longer, than Nightingale. But they've been recently put on, but they're on the Gower Street side. But I can't actually see them from Street View, unfortunately. Going forward, we're on Keppel Street. Keppel Street is named after Elizabeth Keppel, who was the wife of Francis Russell, the Russell family, who own, of course, much of the Bloomsbury area. They're the prominent landowner in there. The Duke of Bedford's, as the Duke of Westminster is, of course, to Westminster. And, of course, the wonderful modernist building directly in front of us, Senate House. I could speak for ages about Senate House. You've all seen it, we all know it. Built 1932 to 1937. This was actually only a small part of what was designated to be across this entire plan here in Bloomsbury. Key architect behind it is Charles Holden. You would have recognised a lot of other Charles Holden buildings in London. So if you've ever ranked at the Conrad St James, 55 Broadway to your right is another Charles Holden building. That was actually before this one. And they're quite eminent of an Art Deco style, especially inside as well. One of the defining features of the wonderful uplit lights. It gives that kind and all like the marble flooring. It gives the style, the feel of like a New York kind of 1920s kind of feel about it. It's absolutely brilliant. But other stations worth checking out. I mean, he done Leicester Square, he done Clapham Common, Clapham South, Balham. I'm just trying to think basically any of the ones that have got like this big blocky sort of frontage to it. It becomes quite obvious once you see them start driving past them. It beats me as to any more of them now. I think Warren Street just off of Euston Road is one of them as well. So coming down off of Keppel Street, is that all the notes I got there? Interesting enough, that current building of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine was opened in 1929 by the then Prince of Wales, who of course was Edward VIII. That's all of those covered. So coming down, we're going to go to the back entrance, of course, of the British Museum. You have this wonderful new building that's been sandwiched in here as well, which is the World Conservations and I can't even read my own writing there. But of course, it's linked to the British Museum to enable them to be able to look after their collection, keep it all going. There's actually 7 floors based within this building, but of course, it has to be built relatively modestly in terms of not upsetting the wonderful character of the British Museum or the neighbouring areas of Bloomsbury. So we're going to skim on by there. Of course, a little bit about the British Museum. 1753, it was first began as an institution by Sir Hans Sloane, the Irish physician. You'd have heard of Hans Sloane because of his use of his name within some of the areas around the Chelsea area. Hans Crescent, Sloane Street, and so forth. 1759, it opened as Montague House. That was on this site. That was the sort of the first time it was open to the public, where he was able to showcase Sir Hans Sloane's collection of artifacts and goods, which throughout the years has caused controversy in terms of what's been stored there, such as the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon in Athens, and of course the Rosetta Stone. Sir Hans Sloane is another fact as well. He's credited with bringing, or the first person to sort of invent drinking chocolate, hot chocolate. This was on his tours of the Jamaicas and the Caribbean. Coming on through Russell Square, obviously the Grand Square that we know right in the heart of Bloomsbury. Of course, again, takes its name from the Russell family, the Duke of Bedford's, who own much of the land within this area. Going to go up here to the corner of Russell Square. Obviously, by the looks of it, there's a film going on. We'll know about of course, the wonderful cabman shelter here. We know who runs it as well. The Earl of Shaftesbury, of course, was the gentleman possible for instigating the cabman shelter fund in 1873. On the corner here, Russell Square, I can't quite see it. Oops, I don't want that. How do I get rid of that? Oh, I've really screwed it up now. Just go into the basement of the school of. Let's go back to that corner there, Thornhouse Street. Right on that corner there, in this building here, is actually the offices of Faber and Faber. Now, this is where a young writer and poet by the name of T.S. Eliot worked, and that's actually on that plaque there. Let's say there, poet and publisher, worked here for Faber and Faber, 1925 to 1965. It's actually when he was in these offices, he actually wrote Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. Sounds like a riveting read, but that then later became the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical that we know of today as Cats. So that all took place within that building there. Other prime establishment, part of the University of London complex, is SOAS, the School of African and Oriental Studies. This is one of the world-renowned schools of this. It's produced many academia across the world that have gone to do great things, such as Louisa Diogo, former Prime Minister of Mozambique, John Atta Mills, Prime Minister of Ghana, Mette Marit, the Crown Princess of Norway, so she's effectively Kate Middleton of Norway, and Dom Jolly. I hope his phone didn't go off whilst he was in the library. Back around Russell Square to one of the most fabulous, beautiful hotels in London, the Hotel Russell, or it's now called the Fitzroy Kimpton. But up until 2018, it was called the Hotel Russell. Architect here, Charles Fitzroy Dole. He also done Dillon's Bookshop on Gower Street, and we could say that's probably where we get, the saying all doled up, Dole House. Legend has it. But one of the features I like to point out on here is the four queens across the top here. I don't know if I've got the order of these right. It's quite a bit harder to see who these are from here. When you're on the street, it's quite obvious to spot which one's Victoria and so forth. But of course, it's Elizabeth I, Mary II, Anne, and yes, Victoria. Yeah, a few people do miss those. They're quite a nice feature to point out on those. Have I covered all those bits there? Of course, yeah, named after the Russell family. The architect Charles Fitzroy Dole, he designed the dining room also within this, which was also he designed the dining room on the Titanic. And said the dining room in here is said to be like an exact replica, a copy paste of the Titanic as well. We're going to go up to Bernard Street. Bernard Street was named after Sir Thomas Bernard, who was quite a large benefactor at the Foundling Museum. I'm going to zoom out of this because I don't think it's going to let me down there. Yeah, Foundling Museum nearby, so that's why his name is shared on that street. Spin around. Another Leslie Green station. Nice flat roof. Hasn't been reconverted for something, so there's a planning opportunity for you there. Coming up to Brunswick Square. Brunswick Square, funnily enough, is actually named after the George IV's princess consort, So that's it's Caroline of Brunswick, and then the adjacent square on the opposite side was his father, Mad King George III, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. So it's Mecklenburg Square, of course. Named after that, because obviously they were reigning within those times. You have lots of the names within this area. So King's Cross is actually reference to King George IV, Prince Regent, as he assumed the roles of king when his father had his mental state, King George III. And that's why you then get the names such as Regent's Park, Regent's Canal. They were all quite prominent. They were all becoming constructed during the time of King George IV, the Prince Regent. North side of Brunswick Square, the wonderful institution that is the Foundling Museum. If I can get down the street, here we go. All the way down, we'll go and say hello to our good friend Thomas Coram. There he is, sat there. Thomas Coram, who's the man who established the Foundling Hospital. This is just the museum now. This is actually a building that was built 1937, but the original hospital building was all across this site, right over into Coram's Fields. It's where the name Coram Street, Coram's Field comes from, after he actually spent a lot of time in Americas. He was trained as apprentice as a shipbuilder, Captain Thomas Coram, and it's when he returned from his time in the New Americas, he saw how bad London had become. He grew up in Lyme Regis, but he came back to London to trade. He used to trade in the city of London. He lived in Rotherhithe, and when he was walking over into the city, he was absolutely just astounded just by the terrible conditions that children were being subjected to, being cast out into the street. This was around about the time of the gin craze as well, mid-18th century. William Hogarth's wonderful portrait, Bear Street and Gin Lane, showing that the ruin that gin was causing on the population mid-18th century. It was either he was really, really rich or really, really poor. There was not much in between, and a lot of people fell into that poor bracket. Child mortality was exceptionally high, so he found it upon himself to raise petitions, raise awareness, and then managed to get himself a royal charter that then built the entire Foundling Hospital on this site. Interesting enough, Coram's Fields, one of the parks in there, is actually one of the only parks where you can only go to that park if you are with a child that's under 16. So no adults can go in, and that's part of the legacy that Thomas Coram has left within this area. I'm going to whiz through the rest of it now. There's not a huge deal more here. John Ruskin, the Victorian philanthropist, watercolourist, was actually born on 54 Hunter Street. Hunter Street gets its name from Surgeon John Hunter. His association with the Royal School of Medicine, which is this particular building here, I believe. Yeah, you can just see there, Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine, and of course the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine for women as well. Keep going up there. It then becomes Judd Street. Judd Street named after Andrew Judd, who developed the area through the Skinner's Company in the 16th century, late 16th century. Skinner's Company, of course, at 6s and 7s with the merchant tailors. They switch the roles every year. We all know that. And we'll go forward. We'll just skim all the way through to that wonderful building. The world's largest library in terms of collections, and of course the George Gilbert Scott masterpiece, St Pancras Renaissance Hotel. So that's kind of been my little introduction to Camden, more specifically the Bloomsbury area. I want to try to do a lot more of these because there is just so much vast history to this area, but I hope this has kind of just opened the feelers and the spectrum to understand what's going on within this area that we all drive through pretty much every day when we are working. Thank you all very much, stay safe, and I'll see you all again soon.